Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We leave the door open a bit longer because maybe one or two more participants would like to join us for this session this late Thursday afternoon. And here is the gong, okay. But I'll use the time anyway to welcome you to the session, which is headlined Linking Networks Funding Cross-Border Transport. I would like to introduce myself to you. My name is Monica Jones, and it is my great pleasure to moderate this session. And I can promise you we have a great panel here. I'd like to start by introducing you to all the gentlemen and the one lady sharing the stage with me for the next 90 minutes. Starting with a lady, Doris Leuthard, Federal Councillor at the Federal Department of the Environment, Transport, Energy and Communications in Switzerland. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Then we have the Honourable Denis Lebel, the Minister of Transport, Infrastructure and Communities from Canada with us. To his left is Mark Juhel, the Sector Manager for Transport at the World Bank. And again to his left is Jean-Éric Paquet from the Directorate, the head of the Directorate European Mobility Network, European Commission. To the right of Ms. Leuthard is Peter Gerber, board member of Lufthansa Germany. And to my far right out there is Umberto De Preto. He's the Secretary General of the International Road Transport Union. So now you know who you're facing up here. And why are we here? What are we talking about? Well, basically pretty much along the lines of what you've been hearing yesterday and today. It's about global supply chains and transport networks, which, as you will know, form the backbone of the economy. We've heard that quite often. We also know that the complexity of today's economic environment, as well as expanding supply chains, require more and more coordinated efforts aimed at optimizing network configuration to synchronize global supply and demand. And that includes investment in infrastructure, but also enhancing logistics efficiency. Problem is, however, that the ability of individual governments on their own to promote global logistics systems is only limited. And on the other hand, financial instruments that are available, they're not always flexible enough to meet current needs. What to do? Well, governments need to develop policy options to allow seamless transport systems internationally, and they have to do this together. So in a close cooperation among each other, also with financial institutions, international organizations, private investors, and we have representatives sitting here, which is brilliant for this session. So while we are discussing, please make notes. If you feel you would like to participate, you're more than welcome. We're always interested in hearing your questions as well. All you need to do is raise your arm, and because I'm facing the light, please make sure that you raise it so I can see it. Wait for my call. And I think we do have microphones here as well, and then you can address your question. If you haven't done so already, now would be a very good time to switch off your mobile phones. And having all this housekeeping done now, I think we can get started. And I would like to start with the gentleman to my left, with Minister Lebel. Now, I just stated in my introduction that the ability of governments, individual governments, to promote global logistics systems is limited. But Canada somehow proves that that is not quite correct. You're actually doing a quite good job at it. So it would be very interesting to hear about Canada's strategic approach.
Thank you very much. We have one border, the longest, but that's pretty easy here, I'm pretty sure of that. I have to be right honest. D'abord, j'aimerais bien sûr remercier les organisateurs du Forum international des transports.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the International Forum for actually picking up on this topic, which is of utmost importance for Canada. We all know that transport is of utmost importance, also for the international economy, and we as governments are here in order to make the necessary resources available in the supply chain in order for cooperation with our international partners. Which approach do we pursue in Canada when it comes to supply chains and the integration of transport? Well, we create so-called gateways and corridors. This has become more or less a global methodology. Global brand corridors are of utmost importance for us.
Probably for you too. Our government is making investment in strategic infrastructure projects through our $3.1 billion Gateways Fund. These initiatives are focused on Asia-Pacific Gateway, Atlantic Gateway, and Central Gateway, strategic corridors, and border crossings. Together, these funds provide the means for Canada to enhance its global economic competitiveness by reducing bottlenecks and optimizing our transportation network. In addition, our government has recently announced the New Building Canada plan. It's the biggest infrastructure plan in Canada's history. That's $70 billion over the next 10 years. And we will do that a lot in partnership because any project over $100 million have to go through the scope of private partnership, public partnership, sorry. This is the largest, and we will do that, and we want to do that very successfully, but in partnership, like I've said. It's luck in a full decade. That's important to have a long-term and provision to. No discussion of cross-border trade is complete without mentioning the world's longest undefended border, the one that supports the biggest two-way trading relationship on the planet between Canada and the United States. Each and every day, $1.5 billion worth of trade crosses the Canada-US border. The ability to move goods and people seamlessly across a relatively small number of border points is integral to our mutual prosperity. In December 2011, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama announced the Beyond the Border Action Plan. It's identified specific initiatives to enhance our mutual security, prosperity, and economic competitiveness. Working with USA, we identify priority areas for investment to improve flow of goods and people. We have invested a lot. I know the time is running. We have invested a lot, and we will continue to invest a lot because that's very important. Only an example of partnership. We will build some new bridge in the country, one important of close to $5 billion on the St. Lawrence River in Montreal area. But we will build a new one between Windsor, Canada, and Detroit, USA, in the years to come. This bridge will arrive in the state of Michigan, USA. And the state don't have, when we discussed the project, the money to do this project. We will invest $500 million in this project of Canadian money because we need this bridge for the Canadian economy. Same we invested in USA, in the border, Canada will advance the money. That will be repaid to Canada through tolls on the bridge because that will be a bridge built in partnership. And that's an example. I can have a lot more, but that's only an example for us. When it's important for the economy of our country and our partners, we're willing to invest in some kind of project. And for us, partnership, I'll repeat again, we need international partners because these projects will be done. So in Montreal and in Detroit, Windsor, in partnership, private-public partnership. We truly believe in this kind of partnership. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Minister Lebel, and because you stressed partnership so much, and you mentioned that you have one big border with the biggest economy in the world, the United States. So how did you ensure that this partnership actually takes place on eye level?
Because we had the honor to discuss directly, I had the honor to discuss directly with the Secretary LaHood, who will leave, we'll have a new one, but we discuss frequently together, and for sure the Prime Minister Harper discuss often with the President Obama of these important issues all across the country, from British Columbia to Alberta, Ontario, and other provinces. We are in touch directly with the main governor, the people who manage USA.
Okay. Because, I mean, obviously partnership should also be pretty important to the second country that we have represented here on stage. It's somewhat smaller. Thank you very much, Minister Lebel. Somewhat smaller, and it's at the heart of Europe. It's surrounded by five borders, five national borders. Then there's also 3 different languages within the country. 4 different languages. Oh, yeah, Rätoromanisch, I forgot that. And you have lots of mountains as well. I'm talking of Switzerland. So it's not exactly a logistics dream to think that you have to pass through this country. Yet Switzerland is one of the most important transit countries in Europe. Tell us how you do it.
Yes, as you mentioned, with 5 neighbors, with quite difficult geographical conditions, cooperation is for us key. And trade was always a driver also to invest in infrastructure. And we have also a huge mobility of persons in the region where some people here on this panel live. We have every day thousands of people coming from our neighboring countries working in Switzerland. So also here we have to invest in infrastructure, then we can move people, and with globalization, with e-commerce, well, we also have to adjust that the shipment or transport of goods is something which is totally different in the future, and we have to prepare about that. We invested therefore for many years in railway, because therefore, as a transit country, railway infrastructure is very effective. And also with the mountains, well, we have to dig the tunnels.
But you could choose a car through the tunnel.
For the moment, we are digging the longest railway tunnel of the world. It costs us a lot, but it's the best instrument to guarantee from north-south, from Rotterdam to Genoa, access to the ports and effective system of transportation. We are integrated in the EU's corridors. Corridor 1 especially, that's very important for us, that we have a common philosophy, and we are very pleased that the EU also makes these strategic plans, so our investments are in line with a bright review where you want to have infrastructure on railway and roads. And that we can also have it timely. We work together with neighbors like in France, Germany and Italy. We invest also there, for example, in terminals, that the transport sector can have disposal to move goods from the road to the railway system and vice versa. And we also try here to support our neighbors that the installation of enough capacity is timely with bilateral agreements and with financial support.
And I believe you also invest in regional lines across the border. And finance it to a large part, even though your part is minimal.
Yes, that's correct. But so far we think, well, Switzerland is in a good financial situation. And we have also budgets that our philosophy that the transition from heavy vehicles or on railways is supported. Well, we also must convince our neighbors, and sometimes that we get the infrastructure and the support of this philosophy. It means also that we co-finance some projects across the borders.
So you're generous because you can and because you benefit from it in the long term.
We benefit from it because, well, if you can, especially the heavy vehicles, if you have them on the railway system, well, the roads are free for cars. Otherwise, we would have too many congestions, and therefore I think the population also sees the need of this cooperation and is ready to co-finance such infrastructure.
When they're included early enough to understand what's happening, that is also very important.
This is very important, I agree.
Yeah. We'll go into that part as well, about the early involvement of all the stakeholders in just a moment. But I would like to turn to another very generous institution. The financial institutions now, and that's of course Mark Jewell representing the World Bank for us this afternoon. It would be interesting to find out how the World Bank goes about identifying investment priorities. I mean, you specialize in developing economies. How do you figure out which transport mode, which infrastructure section actually requires and deserves investment?
Thank you. Well, as far as generosity goes, first you must know that we are making very, very few grants, if any. We are actually lending money. So we're lending money in conditions that we hope are actually more favorable that you could find in the commercial banking system, but are still loans. Now, transport being an intermediate activity, our goal in financing transport is actually to help our client countries become more competitive on the international stage, in particular speaking of cross-border funding, so that basically their goods and services can actually be less costly to produce easier to export, and that their import they need could also reach the customers on time and at the least possible cost. So that's what is guiding our investments in transport for I would say, reaching the external world. Of course, when you speak just within the country, transport has its other function, which is to basically build inclusion within the country, making sure that everybody, including the most unprivileged segment of the population, can participate in and benefit from economic growth that transport makes possible. But really, speaking of funding cross-border transport, when we are looking at helping improve the competitiveness position of a country in the international trade system, that will have to do with making sure that the trade gateways, which typically would be ports, airports, are actually properly funded and operated. And of addressing also the soft side of the equation, which is in particular case is quite critical, which has to do with all the border management processes. Mm-hmm. So it's about harmonization of procedures between two countries.
But there are different authorities, different stakeholders responsible for that.
Absolutely. That's why, speaking of transport, seems sometimes simple. In fact, in particular when we talk transport to facilitate external trade, international trade, it has to include those variables which are actually in the hands of other administrations. The Transport Ministry will possibly help build the port. It will not be responsible for making sure the port has border procedures which are actually conducive to this particular facility being of help in managing international trade.
Or so that this port is connected to the hinterland.
Connection, that will be typically part of what the Transport Ministry's role is, assuring what connections needed. But that's in terms, if we want to focus on cross-border, really what we will be looking at with the country is whether their trade outlets are actually commensurate to the needs in terms of getting the imports in, getting the exports out. And in order for this to work well, beyond the infrastructure itself, that's where we'll face this soft agenda of modernization, mutual recognition, customs modernization, and the like. Now, there is a different aspect when we talk about land borders, and that's particularly true for landlocked countries, for instance, which typically have to go through a transit country before being able to get their goods to market, apart from what can actually fly, which is a limited part, usually, of international trade for those countries. Well, here, not only do you still have the same border management issues, and there's need for simplifications, which are typically negotiated under the aegis of international organizations like the World Trade Organization, the World Customs Organization. But on top of that, there is the infrastructure bit also which plays its part. In other words, if you are looking at a road corridor across countries, not only do you need to have an harmonized regulation as to transport operations on both sides of the border, but to the largest possible extent, you want to have also equivalent characteristics for this corridor, so that the operators can basically make the most of its fleet of trucks and doesn't have to change equipment because sometimes it's mandated by the regulation, or make sure it can actually carry the same load across the border because the axle load is actually the same on both sides, which is not always the case. So that's just a quick snapshot of the kind of issues we have to consider when we are approached by one client country to help them with their cross-border funding.
How much does financial viability play a role in your decision to say, yes, we give you that loan?
Well, being a bank, we are looking at various forms of profitability. Of course, we are looking at the economic side of things and the financial side of it too, in particular if we are seeking to make it possible for a private investor to participate. We have heard several times during these 3 days the fact that there is a huge gap in infrastructure, the need for transport infrastructure financing, that all multilateral banks together for the next 10 years have committed 175 billion for transport, and that makes up possibly just 3% of the needs. Mm-hmm. So it's obvious that we want to make sure whatever we can provide as financing, get the most possible leverage in terms of mobilizing additional resources and, of course, triggering the most economic benefits. So we look at the economic benefits. Part of it will be the financial profitability, in particular for a private investor, but we look also at the social and environment aspect. That's what everybody calls now the triple bottom line. Financial and economic sustainability, but social sustainability, and that's all the inclusion agenda, and environmental sustainability, which all has to do with the climate debate, protection of the environment, do more than do not harm, try to actually put our countries on what we would call an inclusive green growth development path.
Okay, and these are, of course, all thoughts also that are very familiar for Jean-Éric Paquet, who is a man in charge of policies, regulations, who has to bear all of these things that Mr. Juhel just mentioned in mind as well. And he's been developing the so-called Trans-European Network policy. That was since 2007. Now, last year was 2012. And I found on the internet in preparation to this discussion round an article, I think it was March last year, if I'm not mistaken, a presentation by you, in which you said that the Trans-European Network is still a patchwork, so far away from a network. You said to become a network, we need to realize missing links, make network intermodal, interoperable and efficient. We must use existing networks better and make a more binding framework for realizing this network. Now, all of this sounds really good in theory. Everybody would sign this one. How does it work practically?
Well, I mean, you said it all. I think that's what an infrastructure policy is about. It's about a planning framework. It's about setting priorities. It's about funding and financing strategies, and it's about implementation tools. And indeed, at European level, we have today, we have a European infrastructure policy, but it essentially brings together national networks in the patchy way you've just described. And what the European institutions have now engaged on now for the last 3 years, and in fact the meeting today is quite timely because there's now a very real prospect that next Wednesday the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers agree on that new framework. We have proposed a new TEN-T policy, which makes a planning on a European basis with a clear date, which takes the form of commitments to deliver, and which deals with a genuinely integrated and intermodal infrastructure policy. So what looked like a long-term vision will become a legal framework at European level, within which member states, but also EU institutions, can then prioritize their investment, including with Switzerland, and ensure that when the member states engage on an infrastructure towards the border, but in the context of the broader network wherever on its territory, it knows that its partners will do the same, ideally in a completely synchronized way, but at least in a similar time frame so that the investment enhances itself. So that's the planning framework. Mm-hmm. But the second part of the policy, you mentioned it in your introduction, is to link the investment to the policy. Because nobody here is doing investment in infrastructure for the infrastructure itself. We're all looking at more efficient transport systems, more efficient logistics. And the other new dimension of that European policy is to provide a framework where the policy purpose and the policy objectives are injected in the infrastructure policy, and that projects are prepared not only with those which will build and finance the infrastructure, but also with those which eventually use the infrastructure. Citizens, users, shippers, industry, and of course the transport operators which need that infrastructure to do their business. So in the TEN-T policy you also have that notion of a new governance along European transport corridors, what we have labeled the core network corridors, which also include the well-known European rail freight corridors, mm-hmm. where public authorities will work hand in hand with the private sector in transport, but also in infrastructure, including with financiers, to ensure that the investment which is prepared is really necessary. As you said, you should start first by using better existing infrastructure across modes of transport and with traffic management solutions. But then where new infrastructure, and that is particularly relevant at borders, the Alpine tunnels are the best example of that, that we prepare that infrastructure together with the rail infrastructure managers, with the concessionaires in terms of roads, with ports, with airports, so that that infrastructure then is built and serves the purpose of that integrated transport system.
I used very often the phrase, they will work together, they will find this, that out together. And of course, the complete identified funding needs for the transport sector in Europe, also on your paper, is 1.5 trillion euros by 2030, of which a bit more than 500 billion are for the Trans-European network alone by 2020. Is that feasible?
I mean, it's a bit of a tricky statement to make, but I don't think that the obstacle will be financing.
Who finances it?
I think the obstacle will be to prepare the projects. If you have a good project, a properly prepared project, a targeted project, and if indeed it serves the purpose of transport in the broadest sense, then you can construct it with the financiers, and then you can, in a blending strategy, tap into European budgets, tap into national budgets, tap into, of course, user charges, and then for the fraction which will remain, there will be significant fraction that will remain, go to the financial markets, including with guarantee mechanisms, and then close the gap. So yes, the figures are very impressive. Maybe all that investment will not be carried out by 2020, but I think the governance framework and the commitment taken by all players is such that these projects which will be prepared in that better governance framework, I'm sure will attract the financing which they need.
Okay. A colleague of yours, I would like to use a colleague of yours as a quote in order to lead to Mr. Gerber, but you will find the connection very quickly. C.M. Callas, European Commission Vice President responsible for transport, he said, we need effective governance and innovative funds for the deployment of the single European sky technology, and this is a priority for the next financial perspectives. Now, the next financial perspectives, it didn't... 1420. So we're basically almost there already. And I know that Peter Gerber, member of the board at Lufthansa, the single European sky is a very important topic for you and probably everybody in the aviation industry. Can you tell us a bit about it?
It is, and just to make a link to Mr. Joel, we do have borders even if we are flying. And this is one of our borders. It's a big border, and it hinders us from seamless flying in Europe. We have 27 different ATC systems in Europe, and compared to Northern America, where two cooperating closely together, it suggests itself that there is a big problem. And this means it costs an awful lot of money, more than 5 billion euros a year we are wasting and we are losing because we don't have one air traffic control system, because we don't have single European sky, as we call the project since 2000. And in addition, it's a big failure for the environment. It's a big green project, you could say, because you could produce 10% less carbon dioxide, and in those times I think this is very important. And so this project is for the aviation industry on the European sector is maybe the most important project, and this is why we, the aviation industry, support it so strongly since 2000. But unfortunately, we haven't gone that far as proposed, because the goals were clear: 3 times more space, more space for flying, cost cutting from more than a half, and the environmental reduction I already mentioned, but up to now we didn't achieve that, and we have big problems. We are far behind the plans. Nearly every country in the European Union is behind the proposed plans, and
why?
It's a critical point, I think, because of the awful lot of stakeholders. It's very difficult because there are 27 organizations with employees and directors, and they have all their own vision of what has to happen during the next 5 or 10 years, and we have military aspects and all that, and I think it's very difficult to have proper stakeholder management here and to have a clear decision making here. We have a very complicated decision structure on this whole project, Single European Sky with CSR, and so I think you can see there that is very important. If you have clear goals, you have to have a clear decision board and clear decision things in order to get the project properly done. And like you mentioned before, I think again financing is not the problem because everybody can see the benefits. And if we are able to reach the goals, financing is not a problem because we get all these huge benefits out of it.
So how do you propose, if you say financing isn't a problem, I think there's three main parties, each contributing something like 700 million euros. There's industry, which will consist of various stakeholders, Eurocontrol and the European Commission, which also indicates, so everybody, as you just said, really wants this to happen. But how do you suggest to overcome the frontier, if I may say so, of the different needs that obviously you don't have a common goal, if you say so?
So I think we adopted a common goal because this was the sense of the project we started in 2000. So I think on a European basis there's still a clear common goal. We want to achieve this goal, Single European Sky, but I think necessary is the clear will of the European Commission, and it's necessary to overcome egoisms of the national states, of the national countries, and of some stakeholders. And I think only this will be the guarantee to achieve our goals.
Okay, and that is something that you, for example, representing industry right now,
we do, yeah.
enforce?
No,
or do you have any means to say,
we try to talk about it, we try to communicate, this is true, but we can't do it by ourselves.
Okay.
We could only guarantee for the benefits afterwards.
But so far, do you want to? Would you like to? That's a good moment.
Just to note that indeed, I mean, the Commission is relentlessly pushing with most players in the industry.
I don't know.
It's an issue of migration from 27 systems into one system, and it's a complicated matter. It has been difficult in all industries. It's equally complicated in air transport, but it'll come.
You always sound so optimistic, Mr. Paquet. Moving on to the gentleman on the far right, Umberto De Preto, Secretary General of the International Road Transport Union. Start perhaps first by saying, what's the situation like for road transport, cross-border?
Well, I think I need to preface my remarks because otherwise I'm going to be signaled out as the black sheep in this group and maybe in this entire conference. Let me preface the remarks by saying that the road transport industry appreciates every millimeter, not kilometer, but every millimeter of additional road built. So don't get me wrong in what I'm about to say. This said, when we launched an initiative to reopen the Silk Road between China and Europe, one of the main arguments we were confronted with was, but what roads? There are no roads, there's no infrastructure. How on earth do you expect to move goods from China to Europe by road? And it was done 2,000 years ago, but people doubt that it could be done today. So we actually ran some caravans just to prove, yes, the infrastructure is there. But then once we discovered that the infrastructure was there, we said, well, now we have to analyze what is it that is blocking trade and therefore economic development. How can road transport drive progress, prosperity, and ultimately peace throughout Central Asia and then beyond in all the countries that today have been deprived of the benefits of globalization? And we launched what's called the New Eurasian Land Transport Initiative. And what it did actually is we trained truck drivers to collect empirical data that we could then analyze scientifically to assess what is it that is blocking trade between China to Europe. And what we found, shockingly, is that, one, the infrastructure exists. Now, can we have more infrastructure? Of course. The more the better. But we're looking at what are the low-lying fruits where we can get more bang for the buck today. How do we get trade going? And what we found is that in some regions, such as in the Middle East, where we have the League of Arab States, some 57% of transport time, 57% of transport time is lost at borders. At borders. 30% of the transport cost is, to use a Middle Eastern expression, bakshish, illicit payments. So when we see what is actually blocking trade, it's not the infrastructure, it's the formalities that are there. And when we say, we need to streamline processes or we need a one-stop shop, That's not enough. We have to think globally. I mentioned to a few people earlier that to have a cup of coffee in Geneva, if we sit down at Bourg de Four and have a nice coffee together next time you're in Geneva, it will take 29 companies from 18 countries just to have a simple cup of coffee, just to show how complex global supply chains are. To make a car is 10,000 suppliers from around the world, just to show how complex it is. So,
would it be easier by plane? Competition?
Honestly, no. At the end, it's a matter of everyone is a movement. And when I talk about the 29 companies, it means there'll be 29 separate movements just to bring something together. And that's part of the production process. But in the end, we can say, okay, we can invest heavily and spend billions and billions in infrastructure, which eventually you can once you start developing an economy. But in countries in Central Asia, in Africa, where they don't have the means today, the governments don't have the income as you have in Switzerland, where you do have taxpayers that will say, yes, I'll pay all of this and subsidize railways. In Africa, you don't have that sort of income that governments can receive from a well-developed economy. In fact, I just came back from Addis Ababa 1 week ago, and they made a calculation at the African Union that they can double trade between all the African states, double trade, simply by putting in place facilitation instruments without touching infrastructure yet.
Why don't they?
That's their next step. They're building a plan, and they actually said you're coming at the right time, because what we want to promote is that they implement not a regional agreement, but rather a global agreement, and that they put in place the main UN instruments, notably the Harmonization Convention, that makes it that when a business arrives at a border, they know exactly what has to be presented, and the customs know exactly what needs to be inspected. And plus the tier convention that then gives a guarantee to the customs that their customs excise duties will be paid, and then allows the truck to go from origin to destination and only be checked at the beginning, at the end, and not along the borders. So this is what we'll work with Africa and also with South America, which equally needs this sort of help.
That just reminds me of what Mr. Jewell also said. I mean, is that something that the World Bank also promotes?
Oh, yes, absolutely, and that's why I mentioned it, saying the soft side of the equation, basically. And actually, one doesn't go without the other. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to improve roads going on both sides of the border, even possibly improve the border itself, if you don't look at the procedures which are impeding traffic. And actually, we have been faced sometimes by such requests saying, well, we need to extend the parking lot for trucks at the border by 5 times because of the time it takes to cross. Our answer will be, maybe we should first take a look at the procedure so that we avoid building the additional parking lot in the first place and make sure that trucks actually move more freely and more quickly.
May I give you a very concrete example of that? There was new infrastructure built in North Africa, in fact, at Port Tanger Med in Morocco, and I don't know if the minister from Morocco is here, but he could attest to this. They built the port, but they realized that if they didn't change the procedures, they would have days, if not weeks, of waiting times. So today trucks arrive on Ro-Ro, so this is a multimodal example, from Spain, from France, from Italy, and instead of taking days, if not weeks, it takes 1 hour, because they put in place the tier and harmonization conventions. Truck gets off, and it continues on, because they put in place the procedures. So, yes, build infrastructure, but first and foremost, put in place what costs next to nothing, the procedures. It can be easily done, and from the time that a government signs a convention, whether it be the tier or harmonization convention, we can put this in place within 6 months. It's our job. It's what we do. And just for the Canadian Minister of Transport, Canada and the United States have both signed the tier convention. They have the implementing legislation, but they never put it in place. And for security reasons, it would be an interesting thing to look at. And I know that the Canadians and Americans are coming up with their own separate systems. But within the tier convention, you have an AEO program, you have a bonding system, or what we call a guarantee, and you have pre-declarations, all within the same convention. So basically, you have everything you're trying to develop with three different sides and 2 different countries, all already in a UN convention, which will then allow you then to go to Mexico as well.
Do you need a microphone there?
Yeah, no problem. You already know that I'm working very hard on that, and we need to be two to tango. We're working very hard on that with them. And that's our goal, to facilitate what you have said. We're changing the rules. Our government have lowered incomes and taxes 115 times since we're in government. We want to take off all what we can about regulations. We have a rule now, if we have a new bill, we have to scrap one. That's the way we're managing things. We're businessmen and women doing politics. That's not that different in other countries. And we want to do the right thing to support the economy. And what we have said, that's one of our main goals. We'll continue to work on that.
I would also join in this discussion because I think it's very important what came out maybe in the single sky, maybe in road, maybe on railways. We have different standards. We have no facilitation at custom units. In the Doha round on WTO, which still is ongoing, one negotiation is about trade facilitation, and it's actually all about standardization of procedures, standardization of valor. A construction of a road may not be totally different from Canada to Switzerland, but normally in every country you have a quality standard which is a little bit different. You have an organization with your Swiss finish or Canadian finish, so the constructor company has to apply if this is approved. And so here, interoperability, standardization is one element we have to look at, that this could facilitate the construction sector, transportation sector, but also a lot of red tape which is unnecessary. And in a globalized world, it's even worse. On European single sky, well, we are also in this FABEC. This is with France, Germany, and the Benelux. We are trying to be the promoters of a solution. It's also about finance. And it's also about standards. France, for example, invested now in a new hardware software for the surveillance of the sky. So, well, financially they invested in, perhaps for 20 or 30 years. So to change now a system because it could be profitable in another way, that's also a question of financing. But the solution could be also here the same standard. So next time when you change your system, please let's say that's our common standard. So we have the right facilities, the people who are educated the same way, and then it does not matter if this a guy is in Zurich or in Berlin or in Paris. He has the same job, the same software, the same standards, and this could be a goal. And here I think governments are ready to go that way, but we need time, because if you have to close centers, or if you have to quit people, if you have to give up your own standard, that's not an easy task for politicians. And therefore, I think the industry here has a role to play to tell us what could be, the money we could save, that we invested better in infrastructure than in procedures or, common standards would be, in many part of a globalized world, a good solution.
But that's a good offer, isn't it? I mean,
it is. I couldn't agree more. And as you mentioned, we have different roles. You have to look for the people and for the common social sense. That's true. And we have to provide you with the goals and with the vision. What could be better if we achieve these goals? But one point to this financing, I think I'm not a representative of a country, so I may state that this kind of system was kind of political financing, because now they have the system and now they have a clear position, and they did this financing for the system at a time that everybody did know that we need common standards. So this is one of the problems, which means we have to have this political alignment, then it works, and then afterwards also financing works. So.
Yeah, I'm not going to react on CESAR because I'm not entirely an expert in CESAR, but I think the situation is, more, as described, and we have a European standard which is now nearly there with CESAR. The research has been done. We are really now at the brink of deployment, but the deployment will require the underlying governance structure, which is not there. So that's also an issue of chicken and egg. And in that context, but also for the rail traffic management systems, where it's the same equation, very long very capital-intensive investments in signaling, which are then there for decades. And so the issue is indeed to then migrate progressively into a unique standard. And it's, technically very complex, but what makes it much more difficult to achieve is that indeed, whilst member states EU institutions, we all committed. We even have standards and legislation, and the TEN-T policy will enhance the effectiveness of that legislation. We are still deploying the projects with the standard, but then we're adding on national dimension, national solution, national rules. And so we must now move, and that's also what is being discussed in Europe in the context of railway policy. We now must move to a governance system where the decision is monitored and where ultimately it's taken by a European agency, be it the aviation agency or, in the case of ERTMS, a rail agency. Only with that will we have a smoother deployment, and will we ensure that those which invest, and that's maybe the most difficult part of the entire discussion, you have many which have invested in infrastructure or in rolling stock, and it doesn't pay off, because as long as everybody hasn't done it, the front runner is penalized. And we have situations now in Europe where member states, like Switzerland, have invested in ERTMS, but the others have not yet and not on time, and therefore the early runners are not rewarded, which should be the normal situation.
Will they be compensated?
Well, they will have to, I don't think there will be a direct compensation. No, that's not foreseen.
The trouble of being a front runner then. I'm just checking, anybody wanting to join in the discussion? If so, there's a gentleman in the second row. Do we have a microphone? Yes, there's a lady on her way. If you could just then shortly introduce yourself and tell us who should answer your question.
Thank you. I'm José San Martín. I am the General Director of the Mexican Transport Institute. And I would like the opinion of the panelists in two issues. One of them, as you know, we also share a long border with the biggest economy in the world, not as long as Canada, but it's 3,300 kilometers. It's more or less the distance from Madrid to Moscow. And the first issue I would like to hear your opinion, or you have any ideas. We work for a long period of years with our partners in the United States to develop a seamless border. And after September 2001, the paradigm changed radically. It became now a safe border, secure, accurate, feasible, and efficient. But at the top of the priorities, the security became the most important issue. We experienced that in the airports as passengers and seaports also. The security issue or insecurity has become the weakest link in the logistic supply and distribution chain and has risen the costs in a very important manner. In all the world, but particularly in our border, even the just-in-time and the inventory zero strategies are becoming now just in case, with emergency inventories, just in case the parts don't arrive in time, and that has added to the whole logistics cost. What would be, in your opinion, we know a lot of things are being done. Are any other issues being done or some ideas that can at least minimize this element? That's one issue. And shall I ask the second one? Or
let's answer that first.
Okay.
But I won't forget that you have a second one. Would you like? You've got one. Thanks.
Good question. Immediately following 9/11, the World Customs Organization got together and said, what can we do as customs? And it's the organization heading customs to actually make sure that customs does all that it can to prevent such terrorist activities in future. They came up with what's called the WCO Safe Framework, mainly written by Americans. The Americans were the ones pushing, saying we want this done, and it's a very good document. The problem with the WCO Safe Framework is that it is a framework, and that is it says here's a guideline as to what you as a customs should do. There's no implementing legislation. There's no implementing convention. We then did an analysis. In fact, it was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that conducted an analysis with an independent body to say, are there any conventions that exist today that would allow us to actually implement the WCO Safe Framework? And after all their analysis, they concluded that the TIR, the UN's TIR convention, has the best means to today implement the WTO safe framework for the simple reason that it already has within it an AEO program, it has a pre-declaration system, it has a communication system, it meets all of the requirements. But most importantly, if we look at AEO programs, if I'm a businessman and I want to have an AEO status in a number of countries, I have to do bilateral agreements. And I have to go into every country and become AEO certified with all my trading partners. If you're in the tier system, once you're in, you're accredited in every single tier country automatically. And there is mutual recognition of that. So already you have a great advantage. So again, when I said, almost jokingly, but deep down I was being serious, that for security reasons, I think the implementation of these UN instruments, also for Canada, for the United States, ultimately for Mexico, and then further south, is the easiest win for the simple reason is that it is a UN instrument. And not playing politics here, but if you try to come up with a regional agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico, you can be sure it'll be the US that dominates. And that will be the case in South America. It will be Brazil. In the Middle East, it'll be Saudi Arabia. It's the dominant player that will try to take the most benefit for their own country. A UN instrument benefits all, and that's the advantage of it, is that it's a neutral instrument and only made to benefit every country. So something to look at, and perhaps we can discuss later.
Mr. Jewell.
Yes, well, actually, just following up from what Umberto was saying, Umberto indicated what the WCO did after 9/11. It's good also to remember what WCO was trying to promote before 9/11, which has been a turning point as far as trade facilitation is concerned. Before 9/11, WCO was trying to promote the idea that the role of customs was actually based on three pillars. Of course, raising revenues, protecting the countries from illegitimate trade, mainly weapons, drugs, and facilitating legitimate trade. Then comes 9/11, and the security function of customs, which had basically decreased over time. The tax function has already decreased because globally, even at an even pace, the level of custom duty were coming down. All of a sudden, the role of customs became magnified again, and in some countries, was kind of godsend. Here we are important again. And indeed, it made life, and it still makes life today, much more difficult, in particular in developing and emerging economies, because despite, indeed, the motto, security with facilitation, on the ground, you hear security first and facilitation small. And indeed, in most of our projects, we try to help put in place at least the diagnostics methods which will help convince the trading partners of a given country that it can trust basically the way the borders is managed. But that's indeed a tall order in most places, because it's not only about land border crossings. Of course, it's about container trade, and you all heard about the 100% scanning, which seems to be back again now that technology seems to make it possible to scan 100% of container things I'm not yet convinced of. But on a regular basis before those events, a good port, well-equipped, or a good airport will have all the risk assessment systems in the customs administration, and will possibly visit physically 2 to 3% of the containers going through. Now, after 9/11, we have seen those rates jumping back up to 80, 100%, or 100% checking of containers is a joke. You don't check 100% of containers, but you raise significantly all the unofficial activities going around the so-called 100% checking. So yes, indeed, there have been a before and after. And today, promoting the facilitation part of the equation has to contend with this security apparatus. We do try to work also with regional economic organizations to help promote this mutual recognition of standards. The authorized economic operator is another tricky business because it's relatively easy, relatively also for the US and Europe to recognize each other's standard. Also, it's not yet done at full scale. But think of the EU or the US recognizing what is being implemented in Zambia or Botswana. That's a totally different story. So we are not yet out of the wood on this one, but we try to make progress.
Try to make progress. Just before I give you your second chance, I want to make sure that I haven't overlooked anybody else. There is a gentleman. Is this question that you have next linked to the other one, or can I take the gentleman in between?
It's linked.
It's linked?
Yeah.
Then
I swear.
I'll get back to you. Off you go.
Well, again, in the border between, we developed a study in Mexico to propose, in which I participated, to propose in a border with Tijuana and San Diego, a new port of entry that can function as a logistic platform. The main idea is to structure and implement a binational port administrator, very similar to a maritime port, but this in two countries, that manages the flows and directs them in a single unit. I would like to hear your opinion. I would also like, if possible, to hear the experience of our other NAFTA partner, Canada, and that's the issue.
Good, then let's start with the NAFTA partner, Canada.
Another easy one. 70% of the Canada's exportation are going to U.S. When I spoke about the bridge we're financing, we do that because we have some comebacks to us too. We're in business. You're in business with them too. You're trying to have the more easy way to go and to come back from Mexico to USA. But security is so important now that first, when we analyze something, the first element is always the security and safety. And we can do otherwise for the moment. I don't know what will be the future of, but for the moment, that's it. And we have different situations, but I know you're working very hard. You have made a lot of progress for that. And we will continue to work our three countries very well together with the LNA and other issues. And I'm interested to share that with you and to see how we can maybe help in this project, but that's very interesting.
Then the gentleman here, do we have a microphone? Pretty much in the middle. There he is.
Thank you. Michael Robson, International Rail Consultant, so something totally different here. The heading is Funding Cross-Border Transport. One of the issues we face in most countries in Europe, with the exception of Switzerland, is the fact that cross-border services invariably require local authorities each side of the border to come to a conclusion and an agreement about pricing and all the rest of them for these services. And in most countries, a local region is not allowed to make, in effect, an international agreement with the region the other side of the border. And in terms of, just to make it clear for Jean-Éric Paquet, I'm assuming these are international services, so we're not falling foul of any EU legislation. I'm just interested to know how Switzerland has got over that issue, and also whether it's something that the World Bank might like to think about in terms of, if we want to encourage citizens locally to do something, how do we break down this issue about international agreements which are in effect between two regions where there is a line between which separates the countries?
All right, you wanted to, first answer, you wanted to know how Switzerland is doing it.
Well, we have by law an interior market where there still are some elements where a canton or a region has some specificities, but it's not allowed that it's a barrier to trade. So it's not possible. When there would one exist, please inform me that I will go to the regional authorities and tell them that's not allowed. In cross-border services, I think we are integrated in the Schengen area, so therefore on the safety security level there's no difference. On customs services, I don't see a lot of difficulties. I think it's mainly because you have some specificities. Perhaps on animal transport, here we have specific controls, may it be at the airports, may it be at the normal customs services. You have sometimes we are not allowed to export goods for wars or for, it could be used for as a material for war. So here we are stricter than other countries. So this normally is a difference, but I think the sectors which work in these specific areas, they know it totally. And normally, I think Switzerland, we are export-oriented, so we have an interest to reduce barriers, to be very open and to work with standards, internationally agreed standards. That's also why we have quite a lot of free trade agreements where specifically these are standards or barriers to trade. You try to identify them and try to have common formula or an agreement with this country that the authorities use also IT services to exchange application forms or to exchange formulas. Therefore, I think that you have a certification system which is helpful. And here I think, like custom unions or other international organizations, they have something to do. And this, again, I refer to the Doha round. Here we had a lot of elements to facilitate trade and to avoid that you lose a lot of time. And the part of that, perhaps also one element, if you transport in Switzerland by railway, you can transport also during the night, which is not allowed on the road. Mm-hmm. So you actually have, from the market model, also an incentive for the importer or for the client that the transport is made by postal services and by road. Then you have a market element which favors this sort of transportation.
Mr. Jewell, you were directly addressed if this was an issue the World Bank wants to consider.
Well, actually, I know that in the forum is the Director General of the International Union of Railways, Jean-Pierre Loubineau. We should be better placed to answer the kind of question. Now, in the bank, we have a systemic mandate to help countries implement international agreements, and as long as there is an international agreement a country is part of, we propose our help to implement it. And, but clearly, there is a lot of technicalities involved, in particular on the railway side. And I don't pretend to be a railway expert, but clearly each time we can help, actually in Africa, when we do have help with concessioning a few actually regional railways, or at least railways involving two countries, we have worked to make sure that indeed those kind of issues could be resolved locally, of course, but that's a condition to find any investor willing to come and operate the line anyway.
Was there any help? Mr. Paquet, certainly, and you also wanted to say something.
Just a short go, maybe just to broaden it a little bit back to infrastructure and to cross-border infrastructure. Because I think that indeed cross-border projects do require agreements between, on both sides of the border. I mean, of course, between states, and you don't have any major infrastructure project in Europe in the Alps between France and Spain or the Channel Tunnel at the time, which don't have a treaty as a basis for the development. But beyond the treaty and that general framework between two states, it's indeed the case nearly everywhere in Europe and probably elsewhere in the world as well, that the local level of government is equally part of the infrastructure development. I mean, they are funding it sometimes themselves. Of course, the infrastructure is on their territory, in their society. They are confronted with citizens which have to deal with the works and then with the new infrastructure. So we recommend, wherever possible, that these projects have a proper implementing structure beyond the treaty, a project structure which is binational, but then that in the context of that project structure and of the broader corridor which spans that border, we also involve local and regional authorities to facilitate the implementation of the project.
And if there's an imbalance, because, I mean, a headline here is also, of course, funding cross-border networks. And so if you have two different rail companies, rail also systems, one side, the government is interested, the local authorities are interested in doing it up. Same, by the way, goes for roads, which I would like to hear from you. And it's all really pristine, in pristine shape because they have the means or they want to do it. They have also maybe private stakeholders paying their share. The other side can't. That is then where the EU Commission would step in and say, all right, we want to even that out. Is it that simple?
There have been cases where we have indeed evened it out. I mean, there are many cases where on cross-border the EU funds today up to 25, nearly 30% of the cost of the project, and without these 25 to 30%, indeed the political decision at national level is too difficult to make. So yes, we are doing it to an extent. And it's also very true to say that in nearly all cases there is an imbalance in interest. There's always one of the two countries or one of the two regions which has a bit of a stronger interest for that cross-border. And usually it's peripheral countries which want to get into the internal market, which are keenest to develop the infrastructure. And it's indeed beyond the bilateral relation between two states, which is, of course, the starting point of it. There is a role then for the European framework, for that better framework which we described at the outset, to be put in place to ensure that you have commitments on both sides, instruments which join on both sides, so that the investment is prepared and carried out jointly.
I just forgot one element which is normally very important but also very difficult. That's labor rights. In railway conditions where you have projects which pass 2 or 3 countries, we have one element, for example, now with France in the region of Geneva. So the question is, in France you work 36 hours a week. In Switzerland it's 41. So, but as an operator you would like one standard and you would like to have the same people on the French and on the Swiss side. So what's now the labor right? These are quite difficult questions, and normally a lot of nations, they think, well, we are one nation, our labor rights have to be accepted. So this always needs a state contract, actually, that you have a specific solution for this specific idea. And I think this could be also helpful, that you work also here towards some harmonization or at least a common understanding that education but also the labor rights in cross-border infrastructure can be solved.
Perhaps I can offer the gentleman a practical example of what he was alluding to. The Turks, in particular the Chamber of Commerce, TOBB, they invested in a border crossing at Capiculi. They worked with the authorities on both sides. They built a new infrastructure with the intent that in 20 years they give the infrastructure back to the authorities. So they run it, and then they give it back to the authorities. And all the concessions are in there, the stores, everything, it's back to the authorities. But again, it's smart. It's for their exports so they can do something. They work with both sides, so there's only one inspection. The two sides agree that there's one inspection conducted, and moreover, instead of just building infrastructure and then being blocked at the border, we've put in place there what we call tier EPD green lanes. So in other words, tier electronic pre-declaration. The truck, before it comes, it sends a pre-declaration. If the risk assessment is done and the person can pass, the truck doesn't even stop. It just keeps going right through. So again, build the infrastructure but put in place the procedures again. So it can be done, and I'm sure even in the railways it can be done. You just have to have willing partners. And we have to start using our heads. And about using our heads, one of the other things we need to do about the low-lying fruits is using existing infrastructure. And the minister just cited the fact that there are weekend and nighttime bans in some countries. Yeah. And wouldn't it be smart that we act in partnership? And I know that for a politician, and the Canadian minister can attest to this, if you go to the electorate and say, I'm going to support trucks, they'll say, this is the guy we're going to remove. It's not the most loved industry, but it's an essential industry. But if we can work together with politicians, with governments, to say, how can we reward the best of the best? So if I'm a transport operator and I've invested in the latest technology, the best truck, I've trained my drivers, I've put everything in place that I can, then shouldn't that person be rewarded? And why not say, weekends and night times when everybody else is banned, you can go? I'll tell you, it would give a real business incentive to a genuine business road transport operator to say, let me invest in the latest technology, let me invest, and that's without spending one penny on infrastructure, without spending one penny on anything. It's just a business incentive to say, here, you can use the infrastructure that exists. Simple as that. We have to start using our brains and stop dogmatic approaches that get us nowhere.
What this discussion has so far certainly shown, and then it's your turn, is, I mean, we talk about funding cross-border networks, but what I get so far is that money isn't the problem. I mean, there is money there somewhere. It's how to spend it. So using existing networks is also something part of the Trans-European Network policy. Now, given that the existing network is actually in good shape and not like some parts of Germany's famous Autobahn, I only read an article yesterday about that they're in an awful shape, and I know it from experience as well. So, I mean, maintenance, certainly that is something that somebody has to be responsible for and for the upkeep of it. But is this night drive, going back to, is that feasible? Is it something that policymakers could see as something possible?
I just want to make a comment about money. Since 2009, the crisis, mostly, not all, but many governments have difficulties to balance their own budget. And I mean, I'm hearing here this afternoon there's no money, no problem with money. Oh, come on. I think mostly all countries had problem to balance their own budget. We had, you know, I had the honor to manage 4 departments in Canada, and we had to cut 10% in any department of our government. And I'm hearing tonight, no problem with money. Oh, that's not the truth. Maybe some money is available in private and other, but governments have to manage their own budget, and that's your taxes and incomes. That's not only ours. We have to be very careful the way we manage that and consider the right investment. And I totally agree to use the actual infrastructure, first of all. And we have to manage very well this money too, because that's yours. We are able to invest with strategic choices, but money don't grow in the trees. We have to be very careful for that. I only wanted to tell that.
No, it's been printed money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Minister, you're absolutely right, of course. And I don't think we are saying something different. I think what we're saying is that the crisis has indeed obliged all of us to look at the way we invest in transport differently. I think it has had 2 effects. The first one, it has put transport up the agenda of competitiveness. I think everybody was taking transport for granted, doing quite well. In reality, we stopped investing in transport many decades ago in Europe, including in Germany, as you said, with the Autobahn example. So I think it pushed it up the agenda. And in terms of hard choices, increasingly member states are prioritizing transport, and that happened at EU level as well. But at the same time, being aware of the constraint on public finances, I think everybody in Europe is now trying to do it better. And to do it better means to prioritize much more, not build infrastructure where you can use capacity better in an existing one through traffic management systems. I'll come to weekend bans in a moment. Or maybe across modes of transport, because there the investment to connect modes of transport is much more palatable in terms of size. And then, where necessary, and alpine crossings for rail are the best example of that, where necessary, add infrastructure, including maintenance, upgrading. So I think this is why I think that at the end of the day, for the next 10 years in that new framework, we will spend a lot of energy and resources to prepare a better framework and better projects, and when we get there, the resources to finance them will be there. But you're absolutely right, that difficult choices are made by ministers, not by us, much more by you. And that, I think, has changed the way we work a lot. On traffic bans, I think, I mean, of course, there's a lot of interest in looking at the time we use the infrastructure. And traffic bans are, ab initio, an aberration. And there is talk of traffic bans in other modes of transport. And, I mean, of course, air transport has some, road transport has some, rail transport has much less, but rail noise is an increasing concern. So, I mean, this is an issue which needs to be addressed. But at the same time, the way to address it, I think, needs to bring in the citizens as well. And yes, rewarding the best is quite an attractive proposition intellectually. The problem is that there will be many bests. And I think that at some point we'll quickly hit the constraint that citizens feel that at night and on weekends they should be able to drive safely and to drive on less congested roads. But that's, I think, a policy debate, much more for politicians than for civil servants.
Okay, this gentleman has been so patient. Can we have a microphone for the gentleman with a yellow tie, if I can see from here? The gentleman with a red tie is next. No, not yet. No, the other way around. Yellow tie first. Okay, thank you.
Спасибо. Я буду говорить на русском языке. Спасибо большое.
I'm representing the Lithuanian Transport Ministry. I would like to share my experience with you, how we are clarifying transportation to its neighboring countries. You know that we have a border with the European Union, with the Schengen space, and if a container train crosses the border to Belarus, for example, then it's just simply going there without any stop. So that's a possibility that we have created through our new information technology tools. We are working together with the neighboring countries here, with the border protection, with the customs authority, and specifically our cooperation with the customs authority provides for seamless rail and freight traffic. Both directions. We have two trade regions. We have also that customs union with Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia. So this is a good example of a good development here. Now, how have we managed to achieve that? There is a government commission with our individual neighboring countries, i.e. Russia, Poland, Belarus, i.e. on a governmental level we coordinate and also invite representatives of the rail operators, of logistics companies here, so that on the basis then of government agreements we can coordinate. The result is good. We have a train running down to the Black Sea and not stopping at any border, neither in Belarus, nor in Ukraine, nor in other of those countries. We have a single tariff, we have one single train, and I believe that this is a good example of cooperation, showing how freight can be transported problem-free. Let's take road transport. We have this joint border with the European Union, and within 2-3 minutes you can cross the border. Yeah, well, you have to declare that before you get to the border post here, you have to have your freight papers declared, so these have to be submitted in advance, as was already explained here. So it is important to secure your place in the queue as a truck here, and through IT, through technology, through the development of infrastructure, we facilitate fast border clearance here, and then you don't have any queues anymore here. And also, we want more parking lots in case that's necessary, but this way we can really develop infrastructure further.
Thank you. Fine. I was wondering.
I think that's what we say. Trade unions, free trade unions. That's a very good example that we can work together. But we also have to admit sometimes we have protectionism. Last example, well, in the taxi sector, that's also part of transportation. When you lately I was in Vienna. I could not use a taxi from Vienna because the airport is at Schwechau, so you have to use a taxi from there.
Even though they don't
makes
know
no
Vienna
sense.
as well.
From Budapest, they are not allowed to go there. They need some, well, and in Switzerland we also have a taxi from Vorarlberg. They can come to the Zurich airport, but they can't take back passengers. So here also we have also to allow or to say we still have some protectionism to protect our own sectors. This still exists, and that's also part of all these custom duties, the restrictions against standards and harmonization. So I think the industry just can support us in policy as policymakers, because it's not easy to talk about that, and it's much more difficult to say, okay, we give up, competition is always the best thing. Not always easy to realize.
I'm actually glad you mentioned that. It also brought brought up the example of the airport because outside Berlin we have exactly the same situation, just that we don't have an airport there yet that is actually up and running, which I'm sure is something that Mr. Gerber can talk a bit about, because I haven't heard from you in the last few minutes quite a while. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there's basically too many cooks spoil the broth. You have this beautiful initiative, Single European Sky. Everybody wants it, but everybody wants it to come about in a slightly different way. What does this have to do now with the airport? Now, the airport was supposed to bring about more economic drive to the region, but let's put it this way, too many cooks spoiled the broth there as well. And there are never any consequences. Do you think that would maybe speed things up if there were actual consequences?
Yeah, absolutely. This would speed things up when it comes to political decisions. So this is the case with Single European Sky. I think I'm afraid the Berlin airport case is a different case because there actually weren't so many cooks. It's an issue and a matter of project management, and I'm afraid this wasn't very well done up to now. Normally, we do this a little bit better in Germany, so it's not really a political issue.
But it brings me also to what Ms. Leuthard said earlier about like including citizens and stakeholders early on. We had a similar example with Stuttgart 21. I apologize for all these German examples, but I'm afraid we did have quite a few of these examples recently where there were a lot of different interests involved, which eventually hamper the project. And these are also, in a way, a form of barriers, of borders, which don't just exist between nations, but also between various stakeholders and interest groups.
But these are, I think, quite new barriers, because Stuttgart 21, I agree it's a German example, but it's an example when there was resistance and borders and barriers after a lawful case. And so I think this is quite new, and we have to carefully examine it. It's a more question of politics and how a state and how a country is run, because if you got the right after 20 years to build something, you should do it. You should be able to do it. And if political pressure is able to put this away, we have another issue, and we have to closely talk about this in a country and in the public sector. I think Stuttgart 21 is a completely different case from the cases we talked about now.
Please.
Without wanting to comment on Stuttgart 21 in Germany, even if we are at the ITF here, I think it's illustrative, and we have quite a few other cases in Europe of a very similar nature. It's illustrative of the difficulty of keeping the dialogue with citizens open in a process which is much too long. In reality, you come in, you dialogue with citizens, you convince them, and you get agreement because you have very strict procedures on environmental impact assessment out of EU legislation, but largely in line with what was happening for a long time in Germany already. So you've done it properly. But then for 10 years, not much happened. And during these, land acquisition, a number of complaints. So, time necessary probably, but during that time, nobody communicated anymore on the project. And then suddenly the project seemed entirely new and generated resistance. So it's I think, very much about also keeping the communication open around these big projects across the entire period, which is not an easy exercise.
Yeah, and additionally, minorities are powerful now. Media development helps this. This happened to be years ago. No.
And in both cases, even though they're very different, we talk about.
Und in beiden Fällen sind die Fälle natürlich ganz anders gelagert, aber wir reden über eine Menge Geld, und das Geld muss natürlich auch irgendwo herkommen. Aber jetzt der Herr mit der roten Krawatte. Sie haben das Wort. Dankeschön. Nemoto ich komme von der Universität von Japan. Meiner Meinung nach ist es so. Sehr viele europäische Länder haben Maut eingeführt für Schwerlasttransporte. Welche Rolle spielt die Europäische Kommission hier? Wie standardisieren Sie, also welche Standardisierungspolitik verfolgen Sie denn hier?
to spend the revenue of these charges for trans-European network construction. Okay.
Thank you.
That's a lovely one. I think you're more describing the future than the setup today. Nevertheless, at European level, you have what is called the Eurovignette, which is indeed a framework within which member states can then decide, but freely decide, there's no obligation on that, can decide to put in place road user charges. And this European framework is about transparency, proportionality, non-discrimination between national hauliers and hauliers which would then operate on the network on a more limited time basis, and of course also covers issues of cost relatedness, so that it's a fair user charge. But I'm sure there will be maybe more comments in a moment. The long-term vision, I think, is certainly from economic wisdom and discussions also at an international level, that more of these user charges should be invested in the infrastructure. Today, there is the possibility under that framework to earmark the revenue into infrastructure. There is even the possibility left for member states to earmark it across modes of transport, cross-financing from road into other modes of transport. But these are facilities which are left to member states. Contrary to what is happening in Switzerland, there is no obligation for that. But I think there is indeed the need to reflect. I mean, there is constraints on funding. Mr. Lebel said it. I'm saying that good projects will find funding, but the issue will also be to tap into users much more than we are doing it today in Europe. And I think the discussion on a European framework which promotes more the use of these revenues, including in cross-financing modes of transport, is a debate which will take place. But the legal framework is so far, if you want, voluntary, and is complemented also by a more technical piece of legislation called the electronic tolling system, the EETS, which is like for CESAR, like for ERTMS, difficult to put in place because of national practices and habits. But here again, the idea is that a user can travel across Europe with just one system under these various frameworks. But this is being put in place and is not yet fully operational.
I'm sure you have a lot to say about that.
Actually, I do. So I'm in my head saying, how am I going to keep this short? Quite simply, why we were talking about infrastructure originally was how do we assure economic growth? It's all about economic development. That's why we're talking about infrastructure. Everywhere in the world, except in the EU, there's a constant battle. How do we make transport even more efficient? And that means also less costly. Because if transport, and in particular road transport, is not as costly, that means our goods will be more competitive. It's a very simple equation. Go back to the 29 companies from 18 countries to have a simple cup of coffee, understand why transport and competitive transport is super important for economic development. If we then tax, in addition to all the taxes that are already paid, and I would ask any government to tell me how much do they already collect just in fuel taxes, and then what happens to that money, which was initially made and collected, it first started in the United States, to collect the money from fuel taxes for infrastructure. Well, where does that money go today? It goes absolutely everywhere. But that money is still collected. But since it goes elsewhere, they say, okay, now in Europe, let's collect again from the road transport companies so that we can finance other things, not necessarily the infrastructure, but maybe rail. Again, when I say this, in other parts of the world, they look at me and they say, you're kidding. Don't they understand basic economics? Do they just want to take a gun and shoot themselves in the foot? Especially when I speak to our North American colleagues, they don't get it. And when you talk to Africans, when you talk to South Americans, when you talk to anyone else in the world, they're like, but you're charging even more. But then what do they do with the taxes that they already collect? Now, this is not a lamentation. I'm just noting that it's the only place in the world where we keep putting more and more taxation on professional road transport. But the net effect is you then have delocalization of production, because it becomes very costly to produce. You have high labor costs, you have high fuel costs, but then you have high transport costs as well, and therefore production goes elsewhere, to China and other places. The net effect in the European Union is that you have a huge, very high level of unemployment, especially amongst the youth. You have some countries where you have 25-30% unemployment for those who are under 25 years old. Why? Because we're not building a competitive environment for production. And production is the only way that you can have a sustainable economy. And with that, I will stop. Otherwise, we'd have a whole other debate.
It's leading very far. It's going very far now across borders, topic-wise as well now. Checking my watch, time is up. I'm willing to take one more question, if there is one. But you all look satisfied or satiated. In which case, I would like to thank everybody here who was sharing the stage with me this afternoon. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you very much, lady. Mr. Juhel would like to say something.
I just would like to say something simple and quickly, because it's all about people. And actually what Umberto said reminded us that all what we think about those macro-level perspective is to try to improve the lives of people down to earth. And here we at the bank indeed are concerned about improving the living standards of everybody. And very quickly, I cannot help that. But you mentioned the chicken and egg situation. I would like to tell you very quickly an egg story. Because indeed, in our countries, people also do live at the border. And just a couple of years ago, in actually carrying out an assessment for a corridor project, we took a close look with a magnifying lens at this cross-border trade which takes place between people living at the border. And then we interviewed a young woman who was actually selling eggs across the border every day. So every day she was leaving her home with 40 eggs, but she ended up selling only 20 on the other side of the border, because the other 20 she was giving one by one to each and every official she had to deal with while crossing the border. And that's simple, but that was a big dent on their potential revenues. And there are thousands of families in Africa in particular living on both sides of borders, trying to make a living crossing the border and selling something. And it seems to me it's a very small metaphor of the big scheme of things. But ideally what we would like to get to is making sure that the real eggs can actually cross the border and get sold, and that the metaphoric eggs of international trade also can travel at cost, arrive on time, and make it possible to create this additional wealth that we'll hope will be more, I would say, equally or equitably distributed among the people. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for having allowed me to do so.
But that was, it was worth it. It was a nice way to end this session. Thank you very much for this contribution. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, for your interest. You know that there is a gala dinner later on this evening, so hope to see you there, and have a very successful day tomorrow as well. Thank you very much for joining me.